Welcome everybody to our Free Market Roadshow podcast and conversation today. It's my pleasure and privilege to have Dan Mitchell with me. Dan Mitchell is the co-founder of the Center for Freedom and Prosperity and the Center for Freedom and Prosperity Foundation. Above that, Dan is well known internationally for his fight for flat taxes and for low taxes, and has been contributing internationally, not only with his own articles across the world, but also as a speaker. I don't think there is any continent that Dan has not been to. And of course, he has been a frequent speaker from the very beginning at our Free Market Roadshow tour. Dan holds a PhD from George Mason University, used to be a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation, and after that, as I mentioned, he founded his own Center for Freedom and Prosperity, is now a free individual and traveling with us. And thank you, Dan, for joining us again.
Barbara, always glad to be on the Free Market Roadshow.
Well, you're a very prolific and humorous writer. Your blog is full of interesting and really amusing articles. Could you please explain to our audience what is Mitchell's Law?
Mitchell's Law, well, I have two main things that I promote. Mitchell's Golden Rule, which is that in fiscal policy, government should grow slower than the private sector. But Mitchell's Law, which I admit is not original to me, but it's something that many experts have written on over the years, simply that government messes up and then it uses the mess up as an excuse to expand government even further. So bad policy begets bad policy begets bad policy. I just thought it'd be cute to label it Mitchell's Law to try to bring some attention to myself.
Well, I mean, everybody knows about that, and at least there are many female listeners and bloggers who know that and who have all your attention across the world. At least this is what rumors say. Is that true?
I wish that was true, but my main goal is actually to try to get politicians to do the right thing. And that, of course, is a big challenge because all their incentives are to make government bigger as part of their vote-buying processes. And
which countries are there that would have made, that would have listened to you and that would have made government smaller?
Well, if you're looking for success stories around the world, there frankly aren't that many. For many decades, people such as ourselves, small government advocates, classical liberals, libertarians, small government conservatives, we used to point to Hong Kong as a good role model, but unfortunately things have really gone south there in recent years with China cracking down, and international investment has really just gone in the wrong direction now. People don't trust Hong Kong to be a free market haven anymore. So now Singapore is seen as a success story, and it is. In Europe, as you know, Switzerland is probably one of the best role models. It has a spending cap called the Swiss debt brake that works very, very well. But if you look around the world and you're trying to find really good free market oriented countries, I guess New Zealand would be on the list. And a few others, but frankly, we have some major challenges, especially in the Western world. Demographics are working against us, populations are getting older, and that makes welfare states even more expensive. And unfortunately, politicians don't seem to be very interested in reform.
Well, so you don't trust politicians, but you also wrote an article, Don't Trust Economists. What is that about?
Well, that was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, pointing out that economists are often just as fallible as anybody else, especially
You mean they are human beings?
Well, sometimes I'm not even sure they're human beings. I'm not a big believer that economists are good at forecasting the economy. If we actually were good at that, we'd all be rich. Instead of being here talking to each other, we'd be on the Cayman Islands sipping a pina colada because we'd be wealthy stock market investors. So I don't think economists are good forecasters. I think in public policy, the role of an economist should be to simply tell politicians that whatever the economy's underlying growth rate, if you do something good, you'll push it up a little bit. You do something bad, you'll push it down a little bit. So don't try to create 3 decimal places worth of forecasts for GDP. Simply tell politicians and explain to them, hopefully with some real world data, why some policies are good for growth and other policies are not so good for growth.
Well, and there is one other thing that Hayek pointed out. There is no such thing as full information. What about that?
Well, that was an insight, unfortunately, that a lot of economists and policymakers and governments around the world don't understand. They think they can plan an economy. They think that, oh, well, I'll try to steer investment toward green energy or some other area. In the U.S., we have these grotesquely expensive and inefficient subsidies now for semiconductors, and Biden, as he's sort of building on some of the mistakes Trump made about trying to have governments sort of steer resources in the economy, and it's all based on I guess Hayek would have called it the fatal conceit. It's based on this conceit that politicians somehow know better than tens and tens of millions of consumers and millions of investors. That's how resources should be allocated in response to prices, which are, of course, a response to what consumers want. In a real free market economy, consumers are king. Their preferences dictate which investments pay off and which investments fail, and that's, of course, a very important signal to the marketplace. Where should more resources flow? Government, when government gets involved and politicians start intervening, you screw up those price signals, and you wind up with a less prosperous economy.
And less economic growth and more intervention by government in order to fix those problems, as we have seen during the last crisis, not only in the US but also in Europe. First of all, they poured all the money on the COVID PEP programs, pandemic emergency purchasing programs, and then with the subsidies for those companies that suffered from the lockdowns, and then the subsidies for the consumers. So this is a spiral that is going down, and inflation is picking up.
Yeah, that was one of the most frustrating things about the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic was bad in and of itself, but the way politicians responded with these huge spending increases in just about every country, and then, of course, we saw, whether you're looking at the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve in the U.S., the Bank of England, the Canadian Central Bank, I mean, they all radically expanded their balance sheets. In effect, they were monetizing a lot of the new debt. Now, were they doing it because of the fiscal dominance theory of monetary policy? Were they doing it for Keynesian reasons, that they thought the economy needed to be artificially stimulated? I suppose it depends on which central banker you're looking at, but I think central banks made a big mistake. We suffered as a result because of the inflation. And of course, all that government spending, whether it's monetized or not, it's still added to the debt. So one thing I'm very concerned about, Barbara, is that we're probably, we're looking at, I think, another debt crisis that may happen. You look at the so-called pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, the countries that got in trouble about a dozen years ago. Well, their debt levels today, in every single case, are higher than they were back in, 2009, 2010, when things began to go south.
Plus, interest rates have gone up, and paying back the debt is much more difficult now than it had been. And decades ago, as you mentioned.
And we're seeing in the U.S., our interest rates haven't gone up that much, but it's basically almost doubling the cost of servicing the debt. And of course, our government debt is now about 100% of GDP. So we've added trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars to the debt. European governments, as a share of GDP, similar debt level increases. The Swiss, of course, were better than most because their spending cap made it so that they were much more constrained.
Well, they have the so-called debt brake.
Yes, and as a result, they're now being forced by their debt brake to actually have less spending in the future, to sort of, as they call it, a clawback, to undo and to reverse some of those spending increases. But we don't have anything like that in the U.S. Most European countries don't have that. So more and more spending, more and more debt, some of it leading to inflation. It's just not a good recipe, and it's very hard to be optimistic on where things are heading.
Or if they have a debt brake, like Germany, for example, they find good excuses that because of the crisis, the COVID crisis, and the special circumstances, they can have a break from that.
Although I guess their court tried to slap them down.
Well,
so
it was not successful so far.
Okay, so that little bit of good news, you've doused my enthusiasm there.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for that. But let's come back to this spending and to the debt levels. Mm-hmm. So we've been talking about government debt levels, which have been growing forever. But what about the consumers? What about private debt? Is there issues, are there problems that you see on both sides of the pond, and compare them?
Well, I'm obviously much more familiar with what's happening in the United States, and we have certain sectors where there's a lot of debt. We have student loan debt. Now, of course, that's as a result of government making mistakes. Government starts subsidizing higher education. Colleges respond by increasing their tuition. Students think, oh, that's no problem because I'll just borrow from the government and the government's going to guarantee it. But sooner or later, when you're taking out loans, you're supposed to pay them back. Biden's trying to buy votes by canceling that debt, but there are some limits on his ability to do that. So that's one sector that's a problem. There are, of course, huge problems with commercial real estate in the U.S. So there's a lot of debt that's been accumulated for those. And you just don't have the office real estate market is just not going to come back, I don't think. There's concerns about consumer credit card debt. There's concerns about auto loan debt. And I suppose I should make one sort of big point. The U.S. tax code has a preference for debt over equity. So as a general rule, companies themselves tend to be over-indebted. They're incentivized to have more debt. And what's the problem? When there's a recession, your debt levels stay the same, your interest rates stay the same. However, your income to service that debt goes down. And so you do run the risk of creating systemic problems in your economy when you have too much debt and you have too many government preferences for debt, or in the case of student loans, you're subsidizing the debt. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, isn't that a case of responsibility, self-responsibility, and people thinking before they act?
Well, they should, because just because the government is offering to give you subsidized student loans doesn't mean you should take it, especially if you're getting a major in something silly that's not going to be able to translate into a well-paying job when you get out of college. So yes, ultimately people are responsible. Just because the federal government has a subsidy preference for debt over equity doesn't mean you as a CEO should be taking out more debt than you think you could service if there's a downturn in the economy. So you're right. There ultimately should be personal responsibility and consequences, but wouldn't it be a good idea if the government wasn't luring people into making bad life choices and business decisions?
And making people aware that there are such values as self-responsibility, competition, and the achievement principle. So who would be those people to point those values out?
Well, that's what we try to do on the Free Market Roadshow. We try to promote the values of a free market economy, of individual responsibility, of individual initiative, self-reliance, the work ethic. These are characteristics. I guess you would call it a form of cultural capital. Do people in your society think that it's their job to go out and take care of themselves and their family, to work, to produce, to be productive? Or do they think somehow it's government's role to give them a job, a house, an education? I worry that the United States is sort of adopting a bit of a European mindset, at least the stereotypical European mindset of thinking it's government's job to do all these things for you.
Well, we can only warn the U.S. that they must not become European, with all our social democratic states and all this welfare redistribution. I mean, people don't get it, but it's from the taxpayer's pocket from this side to the taxpayers, to the non-taxpayer on the other side. And, you can't create wealth out of nothing, out of thin air.
Yeah, and when you have this massive redistribution-oriented welfare state, what are you doing? The taxes to finance that welfare state punish the people who are working, and all the benefits and goodies that the government programs, they in effect tell people, well, you don't have to work. Yeah. And so you punish people for working, you subsidize them for not working. That's not a recipe for long-term economic success.
Well, first of all, and then if you look, for example, at Germany's productivity or the lack thereof, because German productivity has gone down in the past years and will not pick up again because of also those people who are sitting at home and waiting for their government checks to get them, and the welfare state, and not working enough, and it's kind of the 30 hours a week or whatsoever. Work-life balance or life-work balance is, as I call it, is kind of the most important thing.
Well, I'm all in favor of people, if they can. If you can make enough money and you can be in charge of your own life and only work 30 hours a week, God bless you, go
If you're
for
productive.
it. But if you're relying on government to enable you to have that kind of lifestyle, I think that's a mistake. But here's a different issue that I'm sure you'll know more about than me. Some of the green energy stuff that you're seeing in Germany and the United Kingdom, where the government in effect is dramatically increasing the cost of using energy, that's really hurting the manufacturing sector and a competitive global economy. When you have countries like China and India and others that would just love the chance to replace your own country's manufacturers, I mean, I just wonder, are they? It's almost as if they're deliberately trying to make their own countries less competitive.
Well, you're totally right, and we've seen this in Europe when the Green Deal was announced, and then all of a sudden the energy prices shot up for the first time. It was not the war; it was really in 2017, 2018 when the Green Deal was announced that the energy prices went up, and then the wrong allocations of subsidies, or all the subsidies actually for the Green Deal, green energy stuff. It did not work. It is destroying the German economy. If you look at it, the car industry is suffering tremendously. Solar panels are being subsidized or have been subsidized. Now they're being produced much cheaper in China, so they cannot be imported again. Windmills, wind wheels don't work because they cannot store the energy when you need them. Nuclear power plants have been closed as of Merkel when she announced the change, and then now the German industry has to re-import nuclear power energy from France to a much higher price. So where does this get us?
I guess it gets you where Germany is right now, where they're teetering on the brink of a recession, which is really kind of sad because for a long time, Germany was the economic powerhouse of Europe, but now it seems like it's almost like this mindset that we can afford to have government get bigger and impose more costs, and somehow the private sector is going to figure out how to swallow those costs. But in reality, in a competitive global economy, as we were just talking about, it just doesn't work. And so I worry that, as you said, when you're doing all this green energy stuff, at the same time you're shutting down some of your nuclear plants, that just is not going to work, I'm afraid, in the long run.
Well, there is a term called competition, and this is obviously something that Europe has completely forgotten. I mean, we're being outcompeted by many other, not only nations, but even continents, and that's what's really this big problem.
And of course, it's not like the politicians in Brussels and the national capitals, they're aware of this, but unfortunately, instead of fixing their mistakes, some of what they're talking about is imposing carbon protectionism and putting big, steep import taxes on products from China and India and other countries, for the ostensible reason that they're not being green enough themselves. And we have politicians in the U.S. who are talking about that carbon protectionism as well. So, talk about throwing a giant monkey wrench into the world trading system. It's almost like you're going back to the 1930s again, with politicians coming up with new excuses to try to hinder cross-border trade.
Dan, can we come back to one of your articles? And you once mentioned that economists, and I quote, want the profession to be hard science like physics. So what are the implications of treating economists as hard science? And why shouldn't it be treated as such?
Well, I'm all in favor of using data. As a matter of fact, I think the world is a laboratory with different countries serving as experiments. And I think looking at that data is incredibly useful to see what works and what doesn't work. But when you let empirical statistical analysis be the tail that wags the dog, I just don't know that that's terribly useful, because in many ways the economy is far too complex to model. The economy evolves and changes too much for models to keep track of. So yes, use empirical analysis as a tool, but always base what you're doing on actual real-world economics. And I'm afraid that in some cases, you look at a lot of academic journals in the economics field, I mean, you might as well be math, and I don't think that is terribly useful. Now, it might be useful inside academia, but for those of us who are working in public policy,
and in the real world,
that kind of stuff just has no impact.
You also wrote another article titled "Historians Are Worse Than Economists." I mean, so ignorance is partly to blame for the bad reputation of capitalism these days?
This is very frustrating. If you're an economist and you look at a history textbook and say something like the Great Depression, it's all blamed on capitalism, even though all the up-to-date economic research points out to various government policy mistakes, protectionism, mismanaged monetary policy, et cetera, et cetera. Those were the things like that were the causes of the global downturn in the 1930s. Same thing if you look back on the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. You read a history textbook, oh, it was Wall Street being greedy. Well, yeah, Wall Street's greedy, but they were greedy 10 years before that and 20 years before that.
And 50 and 100 years as well.
So why was there only a financial crisis then? Well, it turns out, if you understand economics, it was once again bad monetary policy, in this case compounded by these very inefficient and counterproductive housing subsidies through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Those were the things that caused the United States financial system to take a big body blow. It wasn't the free market system, it was the free market system responding to bad government policy. But again, historians don't understand any of that, and I guess because a lot of academics tend to be more statist in their orientation, it's very simple for them to write a narrative and write a story that just doesn't happen to be true.
There is another thing. Well, we just talked about capitalism, which is obviously negative and bad and blame and the reason for all the bad things. There is another one, trade. What do you say to those people who blame international free trade? I mean, we only have managed trade these days, but that this is actually helping the down spiral and why everybody suffers and why jobs are being lost. Is this true, or is this just another stupid myth?
Politicians have always had this bias that imports are bad and exports are good. And every industry and the unions representing those industries, they obviously don't want competition. So there is this pressure that always exists to have protectionism that, of course, played havoc with the economy back in the 1930s. We seem to have learned something. So after World War II, we had the whole GATT process leading to the World Trade Organization, and we actually were getting better trade policy, but unfortunately, under Trump and Biden, U.S. policy has gone much more in a protectionist direction. The European Union has always been good in that it has free trade inside its borders, but it's very protectionist to the outside world. And now you have politicians in Europe and the United States talking about these carbon-based import taxes, which are just an excuse to go back to 1930s style protectionism. Now, this is one area, I mean, you have economists disagree a lot about things like Keynesian economics, but on issues like trade, by and large, there still is a lot of support for free trade, but why would politicians care what economists have to say? I mean, I guess they care when they can sort of...
Well, if they vote.
Well, unfortunately, there are not that many economists, and especially in the academic world, the average economist still leans to the left, not nearly as bad as historians and English professors and things like that. So in the academic world, economists tend to be more rational than some of the other fields, but even still, economists are it's like 3-1, 4-1 leaning left, at least in American universities.
This is a challenge for us, and this is actually something why we do the roadshow and why we want to educate people and make sure that they understand what helps what triggers economic growth, what triggers freedom, individual and entrepreneurial freedom. So thank you for joining me, and thank you for running with us during the roadshow from city to city, hopping from one continent to the next. And make sure you also watch Dan's videos and listen to his comments online. Thank you.
Thank you.